Good morning. I'm Jonathan Saltzman, a life science reporter for the Boston Globe, and I want to welcome you to a discussion called Developing a COVID-19 Vaccine and Ensuring that Everyone Can Get It. We're fortunate to have three terrific guests, Dr. Dan Baruch, Dr. Bisola Ojikutu, and Dr. Nahid Badilia. But first, I'd like to introduce Dan Sensi, Chief Executive of Solomon, McCowan & Sensi, whose support made this event possible. Dan?
Thank you, John, and the Boston Globe. And thanks everyone for joining us for such an important conversation this morning. I'm Dan Sensi, CEO and Managing Partner of Solomon, McCowan & Sensi. We are a strategic communications firm providing senior level counsel to healthcare, corporate, real estate, nonprofit, and education clients. Our work at SM&C focuses on the intersection of public policy and business. That is why we're proud to sponsor today's discussion. We're coming together at a pivotal moment as our Commonwealth confronts two urgent and intertwined public health crises. What many are calling a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic has shed further light upon health, economic, and educational inequities, the result of centuries of systemic racism. The potential for an effective and safe vaccine for COVID-19 raises vital questions about the process to bring it to market, and most importantly, that we ensure equal and broad-based access to it. We've seen communities of color disproportionately affected by this virus. These communities must be the central focus in efforts to educate and distribute the vaccine. We risk further victimization and deepening inequalities across these populations if we do not do the planning that enables us to act swiftly and appropriately from the moment a vaccine becomes available. It is crucial that we have these conversations now so medical and scientific communities can work with our leaders in government to build trust and work to serve those repeatedly failed by our systems and institutions. Our firm is grateful to partner once again with the Boston Globe as part of a shared goal to convene panels of experts like this to address issues like these. I'd like to thank John for bringing together these leaders and look forward to them sharing their experiences and perspectives, and I hope you do too. And now I'll turn it back over to John Saltzman, who'll introduce our panelists. John?
Thanks, Dan. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. Our audience can ask questions by using the Q&A tool on the bottom of their screens. Hopefully, we'll get to some of those later in the discussion. Also, this event will be recorded and shared afterward. And now to our panel. Dr. Dan Baruch is the head of the Center for Virology and Vaccine Research at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. He helped develop a COVID-19 vaccine with Johnson & Johnson that's in a late-stage study on volunteers. We also have Dr. Bisola Ojikutu, an infectious diseases specialist at Mass General and Brigham and Women's Hospitals. She's an expert on racial disparities in the impact of the COVID-19 epidemic. And finally, we have Dr. Nahid Badilia, Medical Director of the Special Pathogens Unit at Boston Medical Center. She's an authority on the threat of emerging diseases like COVID-19 worldwide. To start off, I want to ask our panel the question that's on everyone's mind. How confident are you that a COVID-19 vaccine will be approved? And when do you think that will happen? Dan, since your lab helped develop the J&J vaccine, I'll go to you first.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us this morning for this important discussion. Development of any pharmaceutical product, including in particular vaccines, has uncertain timelines. So if anyone gives you a definitive answer as to when a vaccine will be available, then it really is based on many assumptions that may or may not turn out to be correct. There are currently about 10 phase 3 clinical trials throughout the world. So far, 4 of them in the United States, with 2 more scheduled to start in the United States in the coming several months. So it's likely that in the United States, we'll have approximately 6 phase 3 tests, which are the late phase tests of a vaccine that will determine essentially whether they work or not. And it is possible that the first of these trials might read out even potentially later this month, more likely in November or December. The reason why there is an uncertainty is because these trials don't have a specific timeline. These trials have to wait until a certain number of people get infected with COVID-19 to determine whether the vaccine works or not. So it's very difficult to put a precise timeline on when these trials will read out. So the most optimistically, vaccine might be available for limited emergency use authorization later this calendar year over the next few months, and potentially wider spread distribution in the springtime of 2021. I would say that is probably the most optimistic timeline, and it is certainly possible that there could be bumps in the road. Some vaccines may not work, some vaccines may not prove to be safe, it is certainly possible that the timelines could be later than that.
Thanks, Dan. Dr. Ojikutu, you treat patients who I'm sure are very concerned about this illness. What do you tell them, and are you optimistic that this will be rolled out or more widely deployed sometime in the middle of next year?
Thanks, John. So I would say that, quite frankly, my patients aren't asking, and most of my patients are people of color. And I think that when I pose the question to them or bring up the topic, just because it's something that I've been doing a lot of advocacy in relation to, and some of my research relates to this, really what I get is a sense of caution, skepticism. And I've, literally heard, this idea of a vaccine for COVID-19 been called sort of questionable. And I think that is some of the feeling that's going around out in the community. And I think that's evidenced by a number of the surveys that we've seen out there. I mean, the Pew Research Institute survey, which looked at willingness to take a COVID-19 vaccine comparing May to September. 20 percentage point drop across racial and ethnic groups, and amongst Black individuals, only 32% of them were, willing to take the vaccine. So I definitely see the sense that amongst, the populations, the people of color have been, extremely disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. There is some sense that, when and if, the COVID-19 vaccine is out there, let's wait and see how well it does and how safe it is and how effective it is. And then decisions will be made about whether or not people will take it.
Dr. Bedelia, does that surprise you, or that people of color have been disproportionately affected by this illness, and yet there seems to be a more pronounced reluctance to take the vaccine among those very people?
Thanks so much, John. As Dr. Ojikutu said, I think that this plays out against a sort of a backdrop of a long history of potential distrust in the healthcare system. And there was a Kaiser actually poll just earlier this week that talked about the fact that 50% of African Americans say they have caution. They have caution, potentially may not take the vaccine in this country, and 7 out of 10 say that they have experienced or believe that there is structural racism in our healthcare system. And so this is the baseline experience of in minority populations, or those who might come from disadvantaged backgrounds. But the tougher part also is that there's some challenges. One is the involvement of minority groups and disadvantaged groups in research to begin with. Some part of that is caution on the parts of those communities, given the history of medical research in this country. But the other is actually there's some structural barriers. And so I'm at Boston Medical Center, and we're a safety net hospital. And during April and March, as I was on the wards, I think there was a week where 70% of our hospital was COVID-19 patients, and 70% of our patients either come from African American or Latinx backgrounds. And during that period of time, we could not get access to any of the clinical trials. BMC was not part of any of the local clinical trials that were, for therapeutics that were sort of put out. And so one lesson I think for me is that we need to work on building that trust. If we want people to eventually take that vaccine, is that we need to work on building that trust in those partnerships over a long period of time beforehand. But not only that, but we need to work on some of the structural things like involving our safety net hospitals in research and ensuring that they're part of those trials in the middle of an emerging outbreak, so that those populations do get to be part of the evaluation and part of the process.
Well, Doctor, go ahead, Dr.
No, I'm
Oji.
just going to emphasize what was already stated by Dr. Bedelia. I think that her comments in general were extremely important. But I also want to say that this is not a new issue. Nothing we're dealing with here is new. COVID-19 has highlighted baseline concerns. And when you're living in a world where there's clearly structural racism, whether it be in the healthcare system or beyond, a world where there are these overt sort of occurrences that are happening, it's very normal for people to mistrust. So that's a normal response. But in addition to that, as she so well stated, the reality is that there are enormous structural barriers to both engagement in research as well as, uptake of the vaccine. There are many different layers of this that we need to tease out if we want this to happen.
And not just in the US, but globally. I feel like, my experience, I was part of the Ebola response in 2014, 2015, and then more recently in DRC and Uganda. Every single time these outbreaks play out, they prey on the fault lines. They kind of take advantage of the fault lines in our society, and they prey on those that we live out in the cold, basically, at baseline.
Dr. Baruch, those are some troubling concerns, and I imagine that there must be a minimum number of people who have to take a vaccine, whichever one is approved, or even multiple ones are approved, for it to be effective. What is that minimum percentage? And then how do these concerns implicate on that?
I think it's a very, very important question to ask. So first, the percentage of people who need to be immune to stop the pandemic is not completely known. It's certainly believed to be more than 50%, probably less than 90%. So for the purposes of today's discussion, let's say it's somewhere between 70 and 80%. Let's say that we have a vaccine that's perfectly safe and perfectly effective. But if only 50% of people take that vaccine, then the vaccine will only have 50% coverage of the population. More realistic scenario, let's say we have an 80% effective vaccine and only 40% of people are willing to take that vaccine. Then the coverage is only 32%. So you can see that the effectiveness of the vaccine on a population level wanes very, very quickly if there is no public trust. So I think for a vaccine to be successful in ending this pandemic, I think we all agree we would like to end this pandemic. And I think there is likely no other way of ending the pandemic other than a vaccine. If a vaccine is safe and effective, but if it's not trusted by the public, particularly the racial and ethnic groups that are disproportionately affected by the disease, then the vaccine will fail. So the vaccine is important in terms of biomedically shown to be safe and effective, but the public trust is absolutely critical. And the two have to go together for a vaccine to be successful on a population level.
So the obvious question then is, what are people doing? And that can be the vaccine makers, people in the community. What are they doing to try to encourage people to take a vaccine when one is approved and becomes available? I'll ask that of you, Dr. Ojikutu.
Great, thanks, John. I think that there's sort of the short term and the midterm, and it's great that Dan, Dr. Baruch outlined a little bit more of an extended timeline, because we do have sort of short-term interventions that people have been implementing. The COVID-19 Prevention Network, which is the large network that's doing a lot of this work in terms of community engagement and in terms of the research, They've been engaging trusted messengers, so engaging people like community stakeholders, healthcare providers who look like the communities that are most at risk. They've been looking at diversifying the vaccine workforce, which it's not too late to do. I think that there are, efforts that have been made in that direction. Advocating for transparency in terms of safety and efficacy data. I mean, people want to know that the vaccines are safe. People want that information out in the lay public. We need vaccine educators, and people are advocating for that, to have vaccine educators at every community health center, as well as having them at events where people are available, and certainly eliminating any and all financial barriers and making access as easy as possible. So getting out there now to educate people about what may be potentially, available soon in terms of vaccines, doing that now, as well as thinking long-term, what might be the financial barriers. But what I would say that I think is more midterm, and which I think we need to think a bit more critically about, just about how our system works. There's been this enormous financial investment, and then there's been this enormous research investment. What about community investment? What about really investing in the communities that we are hoping to reach? Thinking about longitudinal relationships with stakeholder organizations, really investing in those organizations, thinking more about the people who work there or who work in communities of color and engaging them, not just in this, sort of short-term outreach, but having them really be involved in distribution, administration, deployment, all of these sorts of issues. Thinking more broadly about how we engage people, bring them to the table, and do something different. I mean, this is an unprecedented time, and we need to do something that's unprecedented.
Dr. Bedelia, I see you nodding your head. What are your thoughts on that? And I wonder if in very concrete terms, maybe you can elaborate on what those kinds of outreach things look like. I mean, are we talking about going to churches? Are we talking about going, I'm not really sure what that would look like.
Thanks so much, John. And I'm probably going to be repeating some of the things that Dr. Ojikutu just said. So the importance of this is sort of, let me drive home the importance of engaging the communities that are affected by an example. So, in the most recent large DRC Ebola outbreak, we had a vaccine that was deployed under emergency use authorization, or equivalent to that in the setting of a public health, that was proven to be pretty efficacious from a prior Ebola epidemic. And we had a treatment, the Regeneron antibodies, monoclonal antibodies, that could reduce the mortality to 6%. And do you know what the mortality of the DRC outbreak for Ebola is? 60%. So you can have the tools, but as you said, I think so much of it is the distribution and acceptability of both those treatments, but also your approach to the outbreak itself. And so this framework in which you engage communities is something that we're employing here. But when you look at the way that it's been employed, the experiences when you have for polio vaccine in the setting of areas that are conflict affected, it always comes down to trust. It always comes down to looking at what the rest of the barriers are that community is facing, and meeting them and understanding what those barriers are. And so sure, you got them a vaccine that's free, but those vaccines need to be given out by someone, right? And you need to have enough hours so that people can come in to get their vaccines. And so ensuring even points of access, as Dr. Ojikutu said, are those that are culturally, the vaccines themselves are potentially given out by areas that understand languages, that can keep open for longer hours, that get beyond some of the pinch points that might exist in some healthcare systems in the US right now, like availability of personal protective equipment. And actually it's funny because it's interesting because the AMA had a webinar on Tuesday where they very much stressed that what they're planning to do when these vaccines when they're distributed is to send all those materials out to each of the different communities, to sort of get vaccine administrators, the people who will be giving the vaccine to others, and then to employ additional ones, exactly as Dr. Vasulu was saying, that have that cultural understanding, have the language understanding. But more concretely, I think it has to be basic as going into, exactly as you said, into churches, into areas that are where people are listening and trusting community leaders and presenting that data to those community leaders and presenting that data in collaboration with those community leaders so that it's a two-way conversation and not just here, we're coming here to give you the data. It's what are your barriers? What are your worries? Let's resolve them. It literally is as simple as that, or as difficult as that, if you will.
Dan Baruch, One of the, when we're talking about barriers and pharmaceutical companies, obviously one thing that often comes up is the cost of medicines. I've already seen some questions from some people just wondering what a vaccine would cost and whether there would be any obstacle with that. This is something you and I discussed once as well. Would that be any obstacle at all?
The hope is that cost will not be at all an obstacle. Some of the companies developing these vaccines have publicly stated that the entire COVID-19 vaccine development effort is a non-for-profit endeavor, and the government has purchased hundreds of millions of doses of multiples of these vaccines. So the hope is that the vaccine will be able to be provided at no cost to the volunteer. Now, I'm not an expert on the actual distribution, so I'm not sure if there might be a doctor's fee or something like that involved. But the hope is that the vaccines will be available largely free of charge to anybody who wants to take it.
Dan, I want to stay with you for a second and talk about another very fundamental question. There are, when I last checked the WHO vaccine landscape, the World Health Organization, there are about 200 experimental vaccines in various stages of development, 42 in human trials, and as you mentioned, about 10 or 11 that are in late stage trials. What would happen if there are several vaccines that come out at the same time and seem promising? Could multiple ones be approved, and then who would decide who gets what?
So first, let me comment on the scope of the global vaccine efforts that essentially are now about 9 months old. And it's truly astonishing to conceive of the fact that there may be over 200 vaccines that are being independently developed throughout the world for this pandemic. And I think it shows the ability of the vaccine community to mobilize for a true global health threat. It is also possible, and in fact my own hope, that multiple vaccines are approved, because we have over 300 million people in this country, we have over 7 billion people in the world, and no single vaccine supplier will be able to produce enough vaccine vials in 2021 to meet that demand. And as Dr. Ojikutu and Dr. Badilia have said, we need access. We need to encourage access. We need to encourage trust. We need to encourage access. Nothing could be worse than if there's a safe and effective vaccine and if there's not enough to go around, particularly if that's over a prolonged period of time. So what we need is actually, we need multiple vaccines to be successful, not just one. So that will put us into a potential predicament if that occurs. If we are so fortunate as to have multiple of these vaccines essentially reach the finish line and essentially prove to be safe and prove to be effective, and we can build the public trust needed so that people are willing to take these vaccines, then we might be in a situation where there could be multiple vaccines that are available either simultaneously or within several months of each other, because there have been 4 phase 3 studies that have been started within about a 3-month time frame of each other, and 2 more about to start. So it's possible that up to 6 vaccines could be available and approved in the United States within a brief sort of 6-month window of time. And then how would those be distributed? How would someone choose whether to get vaccine A versus vaccine B? So first, it may not be 6. Not all of them might reach study closure at the same time. Some of them may actually not be effective in the end. And some of them might have more difficulty manufacturing large numbers of vials than others. So it is possible that it'll be less than 6 also. We hope it'll be more than 1. And how many vaccines and which vaccines ultimately are going to be available for the general public is not yet known. But it is important to pursue multiple vaccines because we don't know at this point in time which vaccines will truly prove to be the safest, the most effective, and the most deployable, and the most trusted. But if we're in a situation where there really are multiple vaccines available, then there probably will be some level of a little bit of chaos in terms of distribution of the vaccines. But I would actually think that, I mean, wouldn't it be great if we were in a situation where there were multiple vaccines that were safe, effective, and well trusted by people? And so some of that will be sorted out over time. But I think that some of it might become self-evident. For example, if certain vaccines are wonderful but can only be produced in very limited quantities, whereas others can truly be mass-produced and have hundreds of millions of vials available, then it's clear which ones are going to be used.
That's fascinating. Dr. Ojikutu, what do you think when you hear that? I mean, on the one hand, it makes a lot of sense. Basically, it sounds like Dan Baruch is saying that the cream will rise to the top. But I wonder, when you're talking to patients, what you would advise them if, God willing, it turns out that there are a few vaccines that are deemed effective.
Well, I think we need to wait and see what that really looks like. I think there'll be some guidelines, there'll be some thought into what may be more appropriate for certain populations, as we know now with, the vaccines that we use. I actually wanted to go back to the question that you asked, Dr. Baruch, about access and financing and cost. The issue of access is really much greater than the cost of the, individual vaccine. I mean, access is a sort of a complex, sort of multidimensional sort of concept, in that, we have a large uninsured population across the U.S., and many of them are dependent on federally qualified health centers. Many of them don't get care. Many of them don't have access to a primary care provider, period. And that's where a lot of people access their routine vaccinations. So if we want to think about how to structure this so that we're really changing the dynamic, we're really thinking about structural equity and how we are doing something different. We need to think about how to fortify these systems such that we're really providing people access. We're not just thinking about the cost of that individual dose or the 2 doses of the vaccine. We're thinking much beyond that, and it may take some deeper reform. And I'd like to put that out there just as a thought, that we should use this effort to think more broadly about how we offer interventions and preventative interventions, in particular to populations, particularly vulnerable populations or populations of lower socioeconomic status.
Dr. Bedelia, I see you nodding your head again, and it sounds like Dr. Ojikutu is talking about, barriers are much more than just whether the vaccine is going to cost $20 to get injected. It sounds like she's talking about maybe this being an opportunity to once again look at how people have access to healthcare on a broader level. That's obviously very much in play right now, even with the Supreme Court nomination that's being discussed. What are your thoughts on that?
I wanted to actually speak from both experience from prior scenarios where you have multiple experimental vaccines deployed, actually. So what is likely to happen, and what the Advisory Committee for Vaccine practices, immunization practices is going to do in most of these cases, is if you have more cream coming to the top than you expected. As both Dr. Baruch and Dr. Ojikutu have said, what happens is that certain vaccines might be more effective in certain populations, and might be more immunogenic. So the ACIP would then potentially put out guidelines.
What's that, the ACIP?
The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. So FDA gives us the data and says, this is safe enough. And then the ACIP is the arm of the government that basically allows us to figure out what the guidelines should be in terms of administration, and so what they're likely to do, and based on what they've already declared, is that they're likely to sort of look at the data and make recommendations in terms of which populations are appropriate for what. So there should be a little bit of guidelines in terms of distribution when multiple vaccines come to the front. But exactly as Dr. Baruch and Dr. Ojikutu said, it will depend on availability, the manufacturing, the doses, what geographical area you're in, which country you're in. But then the part that's difficult that we're going to face is that we might enter a phase during this pandemic where there are vaccine candidates that have emergency use authorization and others that are still going through trials. That may happen. It happened, during the most recent DRC outbreak, where you had Merck vaccine that was released under emergency use authorization and another 2-dose vaccine that was thought to be potentially better. And so why would you continue doing the trials? Well, you may discover that the first crop of vaccines are not as effective as we wanted, and that the technology gets better over time. And so you may need to continue doing studies. So how do you ethically conduct a trial of a vaccine that while you have another one that has emergency use authorization? So that's going to be an interesting potential dilemma that might arise. But I wanted to actually just point out to Dr. Ojikuto's point, the points of access are going to be important. And what I was looking with great interest on is what is the plan for HHS, the Health and Human Services Agency, and the CDC and the Department of Defense, all of which are part of Operation Warp Speed. What is their plan for these points of administration? And here are some of the things that they're looking at in terms of administration sites: pharmacies, long-term care providers, home health, Indian health services, other federal entity sites, public health clinics, hospitals, doctors' offices, mobile vaccination, and mass vaccination. And so it really will be thinking outside the box. This will not be vaccination as usual. This will be a mass effort when those vaccines are available, and it will require resources. And when you listen to the testimony from CDC Director Robert Redfield about a month ago, when they talked about this plan that Operation Warp Speed has for distribution, they put together this distribution plan and community outreach plan, and then they said, we need $5 to $6 billion. The CDC needs $5 to $6 billion, which, by the way, we don't have currently. So just putting it out there. The plans look great in person. What would be great to see is that the funding comes through to actually carry them out and to ensure that the funding comes through in an equitable way, so that all those points of access that we just talked about and all those efforts that we just talked about are actually funded in a timely manner.
Dan Baruch, just listening to Dr. Bedelia rattle off that list of challenges ahead, it makes me feel that, the development of the vaccine is just one small, obviously critical, but component of the whole thing. So, I mean, is it realistic that widespread distribution of a vaccine in the middle of the year could happen?
I think as I said, it's an optimistic scenario. I think it could happen because there is a huge interest in developing and distributing safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines. But it will require an infrastructure that is really unique. It will not be business as usual, as Dr. Bedelia has mentioned. And I think it starts from the demonstration of safety and efficacy. And hopefully with that will then come further discussions with the public, increasing the public trust once the data exists, showing safety and immunogenicity and efficacy. And then the operational aspects of making sure that everyone in the population, particularly those who traditionally are the most underserved, have access campaign be successful, and only then will a vaccine be able to help end the pandemic.
It makes me feel, though, that when the president has brought up the possibility of even having a vaccine available to some people before Election Day, I mean, based on what I'm hearing, that seems not even remotely possible. Would you agree with that, Dan?
So the FDA has released recommendations for enhanced safety of a vaccine and requesting at least 2 months of safety follow-up of the entire cohort. If that is enforced, then it would not be possible to have a vaccine before election, just because the earliest that could possibly be would be the end of November.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about something else, another very mundane question. some of these vaccines require 2 dosages. I know the J&J vaccine would at this point would require 1 dose. Isn't that right, Dr. Baruch? I think we may be having a little problem with his audio. At any rate, do you see, Dr. Ojikuto, do you see that as a concern, that if you might have to have people come back twice, if they're already skeptical, that might be a big problem?
Certainly, I would love to hear more about what Dan's response is, but I mean, I think logistically, if you're thinking about questions regarding, mistrust or lack of access to healthcare or other barriers, there are many to accessing healthcare, whether it be at a pharmacy or in a mobile van or whatever, then yes, certainly coming back for 2 doses is an important issue. I definitely think that's an important issue. Though I would also say that, we talked about how this is going to be a massive sort of not business as usual type approach. And Dr. Bedelia spoke to some of the outlined sort of systematic process that's going to take place. I would really hope that this opportunity is being harnessed to really expand the care that people get in general. This is a pandemic. It's obviously, quite, devastating in many ways. If we look at the number of people who died, the number of people who are affected, the long-term data that we don't have, but there are other issues, and I'm hoping that if we're going to do things not business as usual, that we think about how we can wrap this into systems that are sustainable, and that systems that are comprehensive and systems that look at preventative care across the board, because these vulnerable populations weren't just vulnerable because of COVID-19. COVID-19 highlighted their vulnerability. So let's think more broadly, and I think that's one thing that I really just hope that folks sort of take away from this experience.
I want to get back to Dan Baruch for a second. You, again, because your hospital helped develop the vaccine, the J&J vaccine, we're getting some questions from some people in our audience about the type of people or the breakdown of people in some of these trials. In particular, a number of people are asking about, like, what percentage of the people are under 12? I don't know if you can speak about the other vaccines, but do you know about that as it relates to the J&J vaccine?
Sure. So all the vaccine trials are making a priority of enrolling elderly individuals, as well as a top priority. I mean, one of the absolute top priorities is to enroll racial and ethnic minority groups. The degree to which they're successful in that is going to be variable, but there's a huge effort to enroll a diverse population. Pediatrics is a different question. So far, none of the phase 3 trials are enrolling children under 12, and actually only the Pfizer trial has started to open enrollment between age 12 and 16. The reason is because there is a requirement in general to show at least safety, if not efficacy, in adults before trials in children can commence. But everyone agrees that rapid age de-escalation down into subsequently younger and younger pediatric cohorts is going to be very important, because we have to protect children, and all of the difficulties and challenges with school reopenings really mandate this to be a universal vaccine for both pediatric and adult populations. So it's likely that the initial efficacy will be seen in adults, and then there will be a rapid de-escalation of ages to show that the vaccines are safe and immunogenic in children. Now, a question that is not yet resolved is whether vaccine developers will actually have to show efficacy in children, or is it okay just to show safety and that the children raise the appropriate immune responses? And that will, to some extent, be driven by whether there is a clear immune response, such as an antibody titer, that can be proven to be effective in adults, and whether that can translate to children. So the degree to which science has advanced in the results of the adult phase 3 trials will probably dictate how quickly the vaccines can then be applied to children. But I think that everyone agrees that as soon as it is safe and and acceptable from a regulatory perspective, then the vaccines can and need to be tested in children. Usually the way it's done is in progressively younger and younger age cohorts.
Along those same lines, I know that a number of the vaccine makers have struggled at times to achieve diversity for some among the people who are the volunteers who are in the trials, for some of the reasons we just discussed, kind of a lack of trust among people of color. One obvious question, and I'll put this to Dr. Ojikutu, why is it important to have a diverse group of volunteers, an ethnically diverse group of volunteers in a clinical trial? If I'm a white person, does the disease affect me differently than if I'm a Black person?
So thanks, John. Well, we know from the data that Black and Latinx individuals are almost 3 times as likely to be infected with COVID-19 in comparison to white individuals. And we know that Black individuals in particular, just because this is what the data has shown, is that Black individuals are more than twice as likely to die. So in general, if you want to develop a preventative intervention, you want to include those populations who are most at risk. But to really get at the root, I think, of your question, we don't know if there are differences in terms of immune responses or safety unless we look for those differences. I mean, I think that's part of conducting good science. We want the results to be generalizable to the general population, and we have to be representative of the diversity within our population. I think, race is obviously, it's a social construct. That's how we look at it. We, call ourselves, certain race, ethnicity, whatever. And maybe focusing in just on the fact that we want diverse populations. We really want to be able to, look at data and be able to stratify and see if things are different. I mean, I think, again, that's scientific common sense in a way. But I want to make 2 additional points that I think are important when you start thinking about who you recruit in trial diversity. One, and this is really something I think is important in some of my interactions with some of the trial participants who happen to be Black, is that participation in these trials is really increasing their health and research knowledge, literacy, and awareness. And they're spreading that in their social networks. They really are. I mean, that they, without even being, asked, they said that they're telling people about these issues. And again, this has a broader effect on not just COVID-19 vaccine trials, but beyond that. And then, something that I've thought about and talked about with some of my colleagues is just the possibility that if Black individuals in particular, and also Latinx individuals, see people who look like them, who are engaging in the vaccine development process as a trial participant, might that not decrease this sense of mistrust and then potentially lead to increased uptake? I think these are all things that we hope to do. So I think it is about social justice and scientific common sense, and all of that makes it really important to be diverse and to try to overcome the barriers to trial participation that we've seen for a long time.
Dr. Bedelia, we've been focusing so much on the situation in the United States and even in Massachusetts. You are steeped in how these epidemics can play out around the world. Do you have any particular concerns in terms of how the vaccines can be deployed internationally and what that will look like?
Well, I think John, thanks. We can take a lot of the threads that we picked on today and apply it and amplify them in the global setting. I mean, I'll start with the points that Dr. Ojikutu just made. I mean, the issue of trust and having diverse populations in research, that applies across the globe, including diverse populations across the globe. And vaccine research is important, partly for a biological reason, to understand if people respond to it differently. but also for the reasons that she talked about. I think conducting research in those areas, in resource-limited areas of the world, and having researchers from those countries involved in that has the same kind of effect. We saw that actually, through a lot of some of the other outbreaks that I've been involved with. Having, the perfect example is Dr. Jean-Jacques Moyembe, who's the co-discoverer of Ebola virus, and his involvement in the DRC outbreak, and the trust that sort of, of the population that built, having in-house research within the country cannot be underestimated, and potentially has a role in the final acceptance and uptake of whatever vaccine we release. Because when in the middle of a pandemic, it is not the time to have vaccine nationalism. What the goal has to be, not knowing what the longevity of protection from vaccines will be, and also whether or not they'll be equally effective in every single subgroup of our own populations. There might still be vulnerable populations within our borders, and we're not planning on shutting down our borders forever. And hence, just as we've learned at the beginning of this pandemic, an outbreak anywhere could be an outbreak back here again. And ensuring equitable access to vaccine globally is important, and it starts by financing and ensuring that availability and manufacturing, and we're already failing in that. So WHO has done an incredible effort called overarching effort is with WHO and a couple other international organizations, including the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, the Vaccine Alliance, others who sort of funded other vaccination research and efforts. WHO has built this infrastructure called ACT Accelerator, Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. And part of a subset of that is something called COVAX, which is currently signed on by 170-something countries around the world, both resource-limited settings as well as self-sustaining countries who are going to be purchasing doses for themselves, but supporting purchase of other additional doses for other countries. We are not a signatory on that. The United States has forever been a public health beacon. We have always played a role in excelling at the science and excelling at the humanitarian aspects of this. And the U.S. is not a signatory on that, and that is such a failure on our part for our own self-interest, if not just from a humanistic perspective. But then once you have that access, what's going to be important is all the challenges that we talked about with administration. Now imagine adding on, we talked about lack of access to healthcare. Add on to that a lot of parts of the world live in remote settings, and huge proportion of the world still don't have access to primary care. Talk about the fact that maintaining that cold chain to get the vaccines out to every place in the world that needs them is going to take a bit of time, and that needs concerted effort, and it requires global collaboration, which seems fractured at the current time at least.
Yeah, Dan Baruch, Dr. Bedelia, we just referred to the cold chain. Can you explain to our viewers what that is and why that's important and why that might well be a big challenge?
Sure, absolutely. So many medicines, including vaccines, can be unstable if they get too warm for a prolonged period of time. So in some cases, a vaccine may need to be stored in the fridge, and that is probably possible in most settings. Other vaccines need to be stored frozen in sub-zero temperatures. And some vaccines might even need to have ultra low freezing with freezer equipment that simply doesn't exist in many parts of the world. And as the freezing requirements increase, that will inhibit the distribution of a vaccine, particularly outside of places that might have such equipment, like large United States cities, particularly either in rural America and amplified even by 10 times more in areas of the developing world, such as small townships in Central Africa, that for which such temperatures may simply not be possible. So different vaccines will have different degrees of the so-called cold chain requirement, which is basically the temperature at which the vaccine needs to be kept before it's thawed and actually given to the individual. And the fewer or the less there is a need for a cold chain, that will increase access in the broadest sense of the word, that Dr. Ojokutu, Dr. Badili have been discussing in terms of being able to get the vaccine to regions, to areas of the world, to communities that may not be next to ultra low freezers as pieces of equipment.
Wow, that sounds like a challenge. I have another question from someone in our audience. Why would I give my healthy 6-year-old a COVID vaccine? Maybe I'll ask that of Dr. Ojikutu. It seems like a totally, potentially a reasonable question from a parent. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think Dr. Baruch spoke about the issue of children and they're not in our current vaccine trials. I think we wait for the safety and efficacy data before we make decisions in regards to children, and certainly we should wait for guidelines, as Dr. Bedelia mentioned. The ACIP and folks who will provide that information will help guide us and give us more information in regards to vaccinating children. I think the question may be hinting at broader issues, regarding, like I said, a sort of vaccine safety, vaccine efficacy, vaccine value, which is part of vaccine hesitancy, which really looks at this issue of self-perceived risk or risk that a parent might see that their child has. And I think that that's up for someone to decide, and I think that there will be, like I said, guidelines in regards to who should, be vaccinated first. There will probably be some questions regarding vaccination mandates or, significant recommendations in regards to employment or regards to schools and daycares and so on and so forth. So I would say that, parents will need to be educated about when vaccines are proven to be effective in children. Parents will need to be educated about it, and decisions, will need to be made. But I think that that's certainly, a concern that is on the horizon and should be thought about it in greater depth.
By many measures, the number of vaccines that have been developed and are in late stage trials, it really is remarkable how fast it's proceeded. I know that supposedly the vaccine that holds the record for being most quickly developed was a mumps vaccine in the 1960s that was developed in 4 years. At the same time, I wonder whether people who are developing these vaccines feel that they've done a good enough job in terms of communication with the public. What do you think about that, Dan Baruch?
So John, thanks very much for that question. A lot of vaccine developers that include doctors and scientists are very good at communicating with each other, particularly about the technical aspects, the scientific aspects of the vaccine process. Many doctors and scientists and vaccine developers are probably less good at communicating with the public than they should be. And so we need to engage the public in discussions. We needed to involve doctors and scientists, but also involve community leaders and all the different people from different walks of life. The lay public needs to be part of these discussions, and it can't be driven solely by doctors and scientists. I think doctors and scientists play an important role in helping to communicate the facts as we see them, but it needs to be a broader based discussion. And I think that the vaccine process, in terms of the innovation, the quality, the potential efficacy, and hopefully the safety of multiple vaccines, has been truly astonishing in terms of a scientific accomplishment so far. But I think the communication of the vaccine process with the public has really not been as good in some cases. And I think that is part of the reason why we're seeing such vaccine hesitancy. So I think there needs to be more communication with the public, open, transparent communication, involvement of all relevant racial and ethnic groups in the conversation, as well as the community leaders that we talked about earlier in the hour. And only then can there be a better education of the public and discussion amongst the public about the pros and cons of vaccination?
Well, it's a fascinating subject. We're all obviously very, very interested, and I could discuss this for another hour. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd like to hand this back to Dan Sensei.
Thank you, John. For those of you who may have joined late, I'm Dan Sensei, CEO and Managing Partner of the strategic communications firm, Solomon McCown & Sensei. I want to thank John for leading a fantastic discussion, and Dr. Ojikutu, Baruch, and Bedelia for your insightful comments. Our firm, our colleagues at the Globe, and I'm sure our viewers who tuned in, have deep gratitude for the work you are doing to care for all of us during this crisis and beyond. Thank you all for joining us. I look forward to continuing this conversation and working together to help put today's ideas into action. Have a great rest of your day.